All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Micah Furr, and I have the honor of chairing the Park Scholarships Class of 2021 William C. Friday Award Committee. On behalf of the Park Scholarships Program here at NC State University, I would like to thank all of you for joining us for the presentation of the 22nd Annual William C. Friday Award. We'll open with a few introductory remarks and then the award presentation, followed by a conversation with tonight's honoree. After the conversation, we'll take a few questions from the audience via Zoom's Q&A. The Park Scholarships Program, now in its 25th year, was established by the Park Foundation, a charitable organization named for NC State alumnus Roy H. Park. Since the inaugural class of 25 Park Scholars, the program has grown into a vibrant community of about 160 current undergraduate scholars and more than 900 alumni. The application for next year's freshmen is online, and high school seniors are highly encouraged to apply. The award is named in honor of William C. Friday, who served as president of the University of North Carolina school system for 3 decades and was a strong supporter of the Park Scholarships Program. For the first 14 years of this award's existence, President Friday personally met with representatives from each class of Park Scholars to select the recipient. It is now my pleasure to invite Natalie Chazal, another Park Scholar on the Friday Award Committee, with me to share more about President Friday's legacy.
Thank you, Micah. As Micah noted, President Friday was a longtime advocate for the Park Scholarships Program. His annual meetings with the Park Scholars were among his favorite meetings each year because he valued the opportunity to engage with our predecessors. Friday was an alumnus of NC State, where he was a student senate president and earned a bachelor's degree in textile engineering. He went on to earn a law degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and serve as a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy. In 1956, he became president of the University of North Carolina. The General Assembly passed legislation in 1971 to merge 15 state universities and the North Carolina School of Arts into the University of North Carolina system. In 1972, William Friday was chosen to lead this system. He remained in the role until his retirement in 1986, becoming the longest serving president of the 20th century. That same year, a Council for Advancement and Support of Education study ranked Friday as the nation's most effective public university president. President Friday was a transformational leader in public higher education. He was known as someone who always put others first. Through his distinguished career, he modeled public service at its best, marked by integrity, courtesy, humility, and perseverance. He set the standard for the value and importance of education in this state, and we have been working hard to build upon and honor this legacy. Now I'd like to invite Micah back to present this year's William C. Friday Award.
Thank you, Natalie. Each year, the senior class of Park Scholars selects a deserving candidate to receive the William C. Friday Award, which recognizes individuals who emulate President Friday's dedication and excellence in leadership, scholarship, service, and character. Recipients of the William C. Friday Award selected by previous Park Scholarships classes include outstanding individuals such as Norrin Sanford, founder of Growing Change, Joy Curry, founder and president of Corral Riding Academy, Tom Ross, President Emeritus of the UNC System, Amy Wright, founder and CEO of Biddy & Bowes Coffee, and most recently, Maggie Kane, founder and executive director of A Place at the Table. This year, we are thrilled to present the award to Ms. Bree Newsome Bass, artist, musician, and activist. Bree, from Charlotte, North Carolina, was inspired to be a voice of activism following her experiences as a Black woman in film at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. In 2013, she participated in a sit-in protesting voter ID laws at the office of then North Carolina House Speaker Thom Tillis. Her activism gained international attention in 2015 when she was arrested after scaling a flagpole on the grounds of the South Carolina State House to remove a Confederate battle flag. In recent years, Bree has continued to advocate for racial equity. The Park Scholarships Class of 2021 is excited to have Bree with us today because of her commitment to sustainable community organization, empowerment, and racial equity across the nation. We felt these themes not only honor President Friday's legacy, but also are very representative of the changes our own class hopes to make in the future. Bree, it is with my utmost pleasure to present you with the Class of 2021 William C. Friday Award. If you would unmute yourself and show the award.
Yes, right here. It's beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much. Would you like me to share a few words?
Yeah, if you want to, that'd be fine.
Yeah, I mean, apart from the beauty of the plaque, and I thank you so much for that. I just consider it such a deep honor. Of course, most people are aware of me because of the protest action I did in 2015 in South Carolina. But my entry into the movement was really at a time where we were pushing for more youth and student leadership. And so I really got my start. That was kind of like my focus as an organizer. And so I really take it as a tremendous honor for students such as yourself to recognize me in this way and to see the value of my contributions, because I really do view youth and students as an essential part of shaping our future, kind of shaping the course that we are taking, especially at, such a turbulent and pivotal time in our nation's history such as this. So thank you so much. And I'm sorry that we can't do this in person, of course, because of everything that is going on, but I'm glad that, technology allows us to still connect in this way. And I just wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your words, Bree. My name is Hannah Cooper, and I am a Park Scholar from the class of 2021.
And my name is Georgia Burgess, and I am also a Park Scholar from the class of 2021, and we are both in the William C. Friday Award Committee and thrilled to have you here today.
So Bree, thank you again so much for being with us today. We have solicited questions from the NC State community, and we would love to discuss some of your experiences. We also hope to leave time at the end to invite questions from the audience. So let's go ahead and get started. So first off, what inspired you to become the activist and advocate you are today? And how do you tie together the arts and the advancement of social justice causes?
Yeah, so for me, when I look back on my life, I think I was always kind of aware of, issues of social injustice. My mother was an educator when I was growing up, and a lot of her work focused on inequality in education. So it was something that I was kind of always aware of. But the point at which I really kind of made a decision to really dedicate, a significant amount of my time and energy and life to the cause was in 2013. As you mentioned, we had the Supreme Court gut the Voting Rights Act. And so, the state of North Carolina really kind of went to work trying to pass laws that were clearly designed to disenfranchise voters. We also, that same year, had the verdict come back in the Trayvon Martin case. And so I think for me, it really caused me to question how much was I taking my rights for granted, at that point in time, to see just how fragile all of those things were. Many of the things that I, kind of assumed were set in stone really were not. And I really recognized the extent to which the rights that I had were only because of people, being willing to take a stand, in the past. And so I really had to examine what was I willing to do in my time. And that was really kind of what led me to do that. At that time, I really kind of felt like I should turn my focus away in some ways from the career pursuits that I was trying to make at that time with regard to filmmaking, because I just felt like there was so much going on. I really couldn't see myself returning to, working in an office environment with everything that was going on. What I see now, though, is the power of art and communication and the important role that plays in shaping culture. And that, of course, came into play in how we put together the protest action and taking down the flag. It was, as much a demonstration, almost like an artistic performance art demonstration, as it was an act of civil disobedience. So like the act of scaling the pole in that way was really to demonstrate just the prolonged struggle, of trying to dismantle white supremacist systems and deliberately trying to create an image of liberation, to create an image that could inspire and, to kind of replace, not just taking down the Confederate flag, but creating this image of a Black woman doing that and really challenging white supremacy in that way.
Thank you so much for that response. I guess on top of that, what have you enjoyed the most about being an advocate for social justice issues in your work over the years?
Well, for me, and this is something I've come to kind of understand about myself, I think I tend to respond to trauma and to injustice and to frustration by doing something, And part of what keeps me going is just working in community with other people, feeling that we can make a difference, applying what skills I have to the cause, to the efforts that, many other people are bringing to the table. And that's what keeps me motivated, and I do take a certain pride in doing something like that, and really feeling like I am making a contribution. It's wonderful to get recognition such as this, but even beyond that, just knowing that I'm not simply a passive member of society. I'm not simply watching what is happening, but really giving as much as I can to impacting what is happening really keeps me motivated and keeps me encouraged.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So somewhat on the flip side of that, what causes you the most frustrations in being an advocate for social justice changes?
Oh, well, I think like many people, I am never satisfied with the pace of change. So that is always, a source of frustration. I try to keep some perspective on it though. I do think that quite frequently what happens when, you look back at like the course of history, it often will be the case that it takes a prolonged period of time of people working and pushing before we have a breakthrough moment. So, when I look right now, for instance, at, all of the statues that are coming down and, people like really kind of centering this issue of, Confederate symbology or, colonialist symbology and the importance of addressing that when we are talking about dismantling white supremacist systems. It's been 5 years since, the action in South Carolina. And so, it is frustrating, that it does take a bit of time and it does take persistence. But at the same time, again, what always brings me back to the point of staying encouraged despite all of that is the fact that the past is proof that, persistence does pay off.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Another question we receive is, part of your work involves advocating for housing rights. What can ordinary people do to advance justice in the area of fair housing and housing rights?
Yeah, I think that when it comes to housing, it is really important to recognize how that is a public health and public safety issue as well. I think that oftentimes we think of housing as like an individual kind of issue, can I house myself? Or even if you care about the housing situations for others, we tend to approach it as a charity issue, right? Like what are we donating? What are we contributing to people who are currently houseless? What we are finding now, especially in this pandemic era, is how, the ability of everyone to have safe, stable housing impacts all of us, right? And so I think the best way that we can all invest in, addressing that issue is to recognize that we all have stake in it, to really think about what does it mean to have a community, a nation, where everyone has access to safe and stable housing, and how does that benefit all of us in order to have that? I'm sure you all are aware that we are facing a mass eviction crisis right now. We're looking at a situation where millions potentially could be forced into a state of being without a home. And that will impact all of us. We know what the housing crisis looked like in 2008, and we are looking at something that is like magnitudes greater in this point in time. So really recognizing that justice is not simply about, charity or philanthropy, but it is really about human society as a whole and how we all have a stake in that.
Thank you for those insights. So what has been your proudest achievement so far? And have you had a moment where you paused and were able to feel the impact of the work that you've done?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to say the action of scaling the pole in South Carolina probably is my greatest achievement, which is really remarkable in retrospect because, I mean, at the time, when I did that, I did not know what the outcome was going to be. We got the ideal outcome. I was able to lower the flag. I, came out, save a few injuries, unharmed. The public pressure around the issue led to the charges against me being dropped. I'm still here being able to, speak to you all today. But at the time, none of that was guaranteed, and I really had to make peace with the possibility of facing serious physical harm or even death. at the time that I did it, but that's how strongly I felt at the time in terms of like making that statement, of really taking that kind of stand against racial terrorism, in that moment. And it has really been humbling in a way, in the time since, to just see the continued reverberating impacts of that, to see it have, influence in places that I've never been, I've never interacted with. I've had people contact me and say how witnessing that act inspired them, to launch a campaign, where they were. And so just to continue to see that. And of course, like I said, seeing all of the statues and symbols that are coming down today as well, it's just amazing, so there are those kind of moments. And I feel very fortunate, actually, that I get to live to see that, to see the impact of it, because that's not the case for everyone. There are people who make significant contributions. They don't necessarily get to see the impact of it, or even to be recognized for it. So I just consider that, a tremendous blessing.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Another question we received is, how do you see the future of your work evolve in light of what has been taking place in the recent time period?
Yeah, so I made a decision really in the aftermath of the uprising. We had an uprising in Charlotte in 2016 in the aftermath of a police killing there. And I felt like it was very important to figure out how we build sustained community organization. And what I mean by that is, beyond doing kind of like rapid response to cases of injustice, which are always happening, and that kind of work is always necessary, but how do we really, organize ourselves such that we can set the agenda? And it was actually the housing issue was part of what caused me to kind of pivot in that work, because in 2014, at that time, I was working as a paid organizer, and part of my job was to go out and do issue identification with voters. And so, I would have a clipboard and I would have like a list of issues, and I would ask people in my community what issues were most important to them. And the number one thing that was coming up time and again was housing instability. And that was not even among the issues that were listed, right? And so then following the uprising in 2016, I really wanted to see what would it look like for us to organize ourselves to where we could drive the issues. We could make what was really most important to us the central issue, not just in the election, but in how we are able to make sure that our needs get met, and that we are able to have organized power outside of the existing halls of power, which we all know, to a great extent really exclude the people who are most disenfranchised and impacted by issues like that. And so that's the work that I continue to do today. I mean, right now we're really trying to prevent mass evictions and utility shutoffs. And, again, that's an example of an issue where for many of the people who hold office, are in positions of power, they may not be experiencing that, but millions of people across this country, that is something that is impacting them. Rent is due in just a week or so. And we still are not guaranteed that people are going to have the relief that they need.
Thank you so much. So you mentioned a bit earlier about how valuable it's been to see your impact in places that you never thought you'd be able to reach. So kind of touching on that, in what ways have social media outlets contributed to your work and your cause? And do you see any drawbacks in communicating in this way?
Yeah, that's a great question. Social media is very powerful. For one, I think it's important to note that many of the cases that have been prominent, like if you're looking at the Black Lives Matter movement, if we're looking at the Trayvon Martin case, or even what was happening in Ferguson, we may not have been aware of that had it not been for social media, because traditional media outlets really were not covering these stories. And so it was largely like, citizen journalists and, social media activists that were making people aware of that. It's a very powerful tool in communicating ideas, in challenging, biases in traditional media outlets, and, driving activism, making people aware of issues, very powerful in that way. And I have been, for a number of years now, using social media to that end. However, I mean, there are some drawbacks with it. Of course, we see the kind of lack of control in terms of information versus misinformation, that can happen. Social media, just as much as it can be used as a tool for justice, can also be used as a tool for harassment, can be used as a tool for growing hate groups. We see that happening as well. Social media is also not a replacement for traditional bare bones organizing, and that's important to recognize too. I mean, a lot of the work that we do in terms of community organizing, it's meeting with people, and when you're trying to like really meet and build with people, that still requires in-person, communication, or Zoom communication now with everything that's going on with the pandemic. But it still requires, building in a real way with people. I think, a lot of times if we think about like the movement of the 60s, for instance, oftentimes what we see visually is like the highlight reels, right? Like you see, mass marches and you see people, doing demonstrations. But before any of that could happen, people were having to have regular meetings. I mean, that's the bulk of it, is like education and, meeting and building with people. And that's still the case today.
Thank you so much for that. Sorry, I was struggling with my screen there a little bit. How have you seen, I guess, as sort of a follow-up to that, especially as social media has become more prevalent in our society, and as society has changed, how have you seen activism evolve in the years that you have been an activist?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So I think that the main place of evolution that I have seen, if you're just talking about like this current iteration of movement, I think has been around just that, because the greatest difference that I see between the present and the past has been the evolution of technology, right? And particularly in the case of police brutality, right? And really raising that issue. Part of the reason why we have been able to force that issue to the forefront, and I mean, that has been an issue for decades, right? The issue with policing always been an issue. But part of the reason why we have been able to force that to the forefront so much now is because of technology, because you have so many more instances of this kind of violence being captured on camera. Because now you have, the internet and social media where you can make people aware of it, sometimes in real time, as it's happening, which in the past would have been much more difficult to do. At the same time, I think that there has been this recognition, at least what I have seen over the years, of exactly what I'm talking about, like kind of recognizing the power of that technology, but also its continuing limitations, right? And the fact that if we're trying to have sustained movement, if we're really trying to build power among the disenfranchised, that we're still largely relying on, long-standing methods and techniques that are independent of that kind of technology.
Fantastic, thank you. So somewhat related to that, what is your opinion on the current progress of this iteration of the Black Lives Matter movement, both regionally and nationally?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's amazing because like if I were to kind of pinpoint like what we refer to as Black Lives Matter movement, I would probably go to like, 2012, 2013. The Trayvon Martin case was very pivotal across the nation in, like really kind of leading to this modern movement. And I just think it's remarkable that here we are in 2020 and this is still at the forefront, because I mean, I witnessed firsthand, and many people who have been involved in this movement have witnessed firsthand just the relentless effort to undermine this movement, to try to smother this movement. I mean, the fact that we just had, a national convention, right? The presidential convention for the Democratic Party, and the Black Lives Matter was, something that was constantly uttered or mentioned or kind of like put to the forefront, is significant because it's an indication of how politically prevalent the movement is. When you see the shift in public opinion from just 5 years ago to now on these issues, again, is a testament to the ongoing work of folks on the ground. And that's again why I say, we have to remember that very often it has been the case that what we now consider, to be just or right, or, things that we lived up, were not popular at the time. The civil rights movement was not popular at the time. Martin Luther King Jr. was not popular at the time as much as he's celebrated now. The abolition of slavery was not a popular idea. That seemed very radical, at a certain point in time. And so we have to keep that in mind when we are talking about things like police and prison abolition, climate change, any number of issues. We have to keep that in mind, that, shifting public opinion is absolutely possible and necessary. I mean, that's a significant part of the work. Oftentimes when you're talking about pushing for justice, you are trying to move the status quo, right? And so, the other thing that we have to be careful of always is co-optation. That's where, you get to a certain point in time where what you are advocating for is politically popular enough that the people who are in power feel compelled to at least voice support for what you're saying, but that doesn't mean that they really support it in policy, right? And so we're seeing a lot of that as well now too, where people, say, yes, I support Black Lives Matter, but they're actually not in support of the things that we are calling for, like defunding police and transferring, funding priorities to things that actually help people, right? Like when I'm looking at the issue with housing, I look at how much money is spent on policing versus housing. And those two things are absolutely connected, because what do you think happens if people can't afford a place to live, right? Because we're putting more money into prisons than to homes. You're going to end up with more people in prison than in safe, stable housing. That's just an inevitability.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that insight. So the final question we have that was submitted prior to this event was, what in your opinion is the role or responsibility of universities to educate and inform students about a complete history of race in the United States?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I think that universities have the potential to be major spaces of transformation in our society. And I think it's important to recognize too, I mean, that has often been the case. I mentioned before how I think that, youth and student organizing is very important. And part of that is because youth and students have always been very central to social change. University campuses have often been the site of, significant organizing and change. That's also why universities and students are frequently under attack. I mean, one of the indications that you have an oppressive power in place is the attack on students. And, I mentioned in 2013, when we were protesting against the attack on voting rights, students were one of the groups that were really being targeted in the state of North Carolina. In addition to, African Americans, it was really about targeting student voters because of the political power that students were clearly presenting themselves to be. And so, I think that in recognizing that, I think that universities have a duty and a responsibility to figure out how to not simply exist as like elitist organizations, that are kind of like disconnected from the surrounding world and community, but really active participants in, transforming community and, making the university a site of learning for everyone, not just those who are enrolled, but really like a place of transformation that can benefit the community that is surrounding it.
Thank you so much. So thank you. And at this point, we would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. If you have joined us via Zoom, please use the Q&A feature to submit questions.
So our first question pertains to environmental justice. In addition to your great work for social justice, do you have time for work or at least thoughts about environmental justice?
Yes, absolutely. That is a great question. And really, I think it's important to understand that all of these things intersect, right? So one of the questions people will often ask me is like, how do I get involved? And I really just recommend starting with whatever issue is like pressing to you or something that you're passionate about, because it's inevitably going to interact with everything else, right? So environmental justice is directly connected to social justice. When we are looking at issues of, access to clean air, clean water, safe living conditions. The communities that are most impacted by that, the communities that are feeling the impacts of climate change most acutely right now, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities all around the world, right? That's the reality. When I talk about housing, when we talk about safe and stable housing, we don't mean just simply having a roof over your head, but safe conditions. Do you have access to food where you live? Do you have access to, safe, clean transportation? All of that is connected. So yes, absolutely. Because even if we were able to secure housing for ourselves, if we don't have environmental justice, in that, then, we still don't really have safe, livable conditions where we can thrive.
Thank you so much. And for our next question, we have a couple of questions like this, but given that the course of progress is so slow, how do you keep from getting burned out and disillusioned? What does self-care as an activist look like for you?
That is a great question. So I think that it requires a certain amount of humility to, remember that you are just one person. I mean, no one person can do a lot, right? And that's important to recognize, is that you can make significant contributions as one person. But also to recognize that you are a person and you are a human being. I mean, I say this especially as a Black woman, because I think quite frequently there is like this image of, being the strong Black woman who can do everything. And, part of the kind of like imagery that's tied to the protest action that I did in 2015 is, again, of like the strong, super Black woman, who's going to save us all, but we have to take care of ourselves. If we don't take care of ourselves, we can't continue to show up, for the causes that we care about. But also it's important for us to allow ourselves to be human, in a society, in a, capitalist construct where we are kind of taught to value ourselves based on what we can produce, it becomes part of liberatory practice to take care of ourselves and to allow ourselves to be human and to make sure that we're resting and eating and, taking a break. And the other wonderful thing is to stay cognizant of the fact that there are many, many other people who are also doing this work, right? So you can take a break and you can come back and the work will still be there. And that's also part of the importance of working in community with other people, so that you can step up and step back. If I'm tired, I can step back and someone else can step up. Or if someone else needs to take a break, then I can, step up and help and make sure that the work continues to go forward.
Thank you. So our next question would be, in today's age of internet performative activism, what advice do you have for young people wanting to get involved with activism?
Yeah, I would really encourage you to connect with people who are around you. Like I said, social media is a very powerful tool. I mean, enormously powerful tool, cannot be overstated. How significant it can be in terms of shifting the conversation, because when you're talking about a situation where historically very few people have had access, right, to traditional media platforms, whether it's radio or television or, print journalism, very powerful. However, there can be like a performative, aspect to it sometimes with social media, or people will be under the false impression that that's all we have to do is like, come up with a great hashtag and, and post things. I know that right now with everything going on with the pandemic, that makes it, a little bit more difficult. Like it's not quite, a year or so ago, I would say, go to a community meeting or, find out, but people are still hosting a lot of meeting spaces online, so I would still really recommend identifying like, what are some organizations that are existing that are doing some of the work that you're interested in. If you don't see any organization that's doing the work that you're interested in, or there's an issue that you think is being overlooked, I would recommend starting your own, like holding a meeting space and inviting other people to join you. But when we're talking about like, human struggle, human connection is a very important part of that. So, really finding other people to work with in a concrete way is a really important way to move forward with that.
And here's a fairly connected question, but how do we keep corporations honest and hold them accountable with all of the promises that they've made this year?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be an ongoing challenge, because again, you kind of reach a point where it becomes politically popular or necessary to at least voice support for things. One of the best responses that I have seen people kind of dealing with corporations, putting out their Black Lives Matter statements, is to then interrogate, okay, so what does that look like in terms of your company policies, right? Like, it's great you put out a statement like that, but what does your employee makeup look like? What are you paying your employees? That's the kind of thing that we have to push for, that we don't just settle at, symbolic changes. And I say the same thing with, the monuments and the flags coming down. Just because the monuments and the flags coming down doesn't mean that we have dismantled racism. And we've got to be very, very careful that, folks don't just, lower the flag and then say, okay, we've done everything we have to do and go home. You just got to keep pushing towards that structural change and continuing to interrogate in that way.
And this sort of connects what you just said with universities, but what do you think student leaders can do to effectively incorporate social justice and inclusion in the organizations that they lead? And in addition, how can young professionals push for these standards in companies they join coming out of college?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I think we really have to examine, not just white supremacy, but just structural inequality, period, right? And really recognize how these dynamics show up everywhere. So if we are, in a space, whatever that space is, whether it's professional, whether it's, community group, whether it's, church, whatever the organizational space is that we are in, examining like who's there, who's not there, who has access, who is denied access, who is being given room to speak, who is not, getting much space to speak. Because when we talk about structural inequality, that is the status quo. That is what is normalized, and it's very easy if you are not, being cognizant of it, if you're not being conscious of it and not consciously interrogating it. It's very easy to just operate in the normalcy of that. This has come up a lot in examining nonprofit structures, right? I mean, this has been an ongoing conversation where we might have a nonprofit organization where the goal is focused on issues of justice, but the nonprofit itself is still reflective of, structural inequality and white supremacy, So we really have to be willing to interrogate our own organizations and interrogate ourselves. Because we all internalize these biases in lots of different ways, and we have to be willing to turn that lens on ourselves as well and push ourselves to improve.
Thank you. And I'm getting a couple of questions about the current election. Can you comment a little bit about our current candidates as well as the effects that the current president has had on our students?
Yeah, one of the most remarkable time periods to me was 2016. So of course, after taking the flag down in 2015, I started getting these invitations to visit university campuses and talk with students, and that was amazing. But it was really remarkable to see the climate changing, like even on campuses, especially if I would go to campuses that had significant immigrant populations, right? To really see the kind of like ramping up of, racism on campus, anti-immigrant sentiment on campus. And so I kind of witnessed that firsthand, how that was all happening. And of course, we have just seen in the past few years just this steady march towards a more overt fascism in this country that is just absolutely frightening. And again, it shows just how fragile these concepts of democracy are. It shows exactly how even this concept of checks and balances in our government is, these things only really exist in practice, and we have to recognize that the law only exists in practice. So just because something is written on a piece of paper, right, does not mean that we have those rights. We have technically had the right to vote in this country, since the passage of the, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? But we know that has not been true in practice, right? So just because we have on paper something that says we have a democracy does not mean that we actually have it. And that's what we are seeing even more clearly in this time period. So, we go through this thing every election cycle where people say this is the most, important election of our lifetimes. And I mean, it's true in a way. It's true in a way because the stakes keep getting higher because we have, over subsequent election cycles, we just keep marching closer and closer towards this fascist state, which is kind of represented by what is happening right now with the Trump administration. And so in my view, I say this repeatedly, if anybody has followed me on Twitter, I've been saying this for a number of years now, that, the election is not a solution. And that's important to understand, right? Like, it's not like we're going to vote and these issues are going to be solved, because these issues existed long before this current era that we are in right now. And we have to understand that if we're going to come out of it. But that said, people need to recognize that if this current administration is allowed to stay in power, either by, claiming victory, either by getting an outright victory in the election, or by claiming victory, or by simply refusing to leave, then we are facing a really horrendous situation. We've already seen what has happened with child separation at the border. We already know that this administration has, discussed things such as, disappearing people to facilities and things like that. And please recognize, like, I'm among a chorus of voices of people who have been ringing this alarm for years now. And everything that we have lifted up as worst case scenario so far has come to pass, including the Trump administration repeatedly hinting at the possibility that they may refuse to leave. So yes, everything is at stake. And please recognize that regardless of what happens in November, we are still going to have to continue a process of mass resistance and mass organizing if we are actually going to achieve a multiracial democracy in this country.
Thank you. So there's a couple of questions related to this one, but there's been a significant uptick in incidences of misogynoir in the US of late. What do you think we should do as a society or campus community to recognize and celebrate the humanity and brilliance of Black women like yourself?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that part of it requires a willingness to address the way that white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, right, interacts with Black women and the experiences of Black women in this country specifically. I find it really interesting, going back to, talking about the social media culture online, the greatest pushback I will get, and I'm sure this is true for many, especially Black women online, is whenever we try to talk about how issues impact us directly and specifically, and that is rooted in slavery. It's rooted in colonialism, in this country. The way that enslavement was determined in this country was like a legal status was based on the status of your mother. And that was because there was so many incidents of rape that were going on that they had to figure out what is the legal status of these children who are born to, a Black mother and a white father. And the determination was that your status, whether you were a slave or free, was determined by the status of your mother. So the structures of this society for centuries now have really been organized around the enslavement of Black women, the commodification of Black women's bodies, the commodification and exploitation of their children, right? And so if we are really going to get to the root of that kind of misogynoir, the specific ways that racism and sexism kind of intersect rather, in the ways that Black women are treated in this country, we have to be willing to talk specifically about the experience of Black women and recognize that you can't address that by just talking about Black people in general, right? Or just talking about women in general. And oftentimes there is this perception that Black women, the issues of Black women will be solved either by just addressing, feminism or by just addressing racism, and not the specific ways that those two things intersect in our experience. And we have to talk about that. We also have to be willing to talk about trans misogyny, right? And the way that the experiences of Black trans women as well, the experience of Black gender nonconforming people, because again, all of the ways that this system interacts with those groups of people traces back to the hierarchy of race and gender that was put in place for the purposes of chattel slavery, which was present in this country much longer, right? We've got to understand that too. That was the order of the day in this country much longer than this current, order that we are living in right now, this kind of tentative democracy that we are living under right now.
Thank you. And we're just getting so many questions. But in a city like Charlotte, where the mayor is a Black woman and the county sheriff is Black, how useful is representation when the institutions they support continue to oppress the Black community?
Excellent question. Excellent question. So again, back to understanding structures, right? And why structural change is important, because simply having someone who looks like us, or comes from where we come from, holding a position in power within the system does not change the system, right? If the analogy that I use oftentimes is like being CEO of McDonald's, right? Like if you are CEO of McDonald's, McDonald's makes burgers. That's what it does. Regardless of who is in that position, that is what is made. And so we have to recognize both the power of representation. Yes, of course, there's power in representation. I don't think that we would see everything that we're seeing today had we not had a Black person elected to the presidency, for instance, right? Because I think just the visual of seeing a Black family in the White House, it made clear to people what was possible, right? And so you had, for a certain segment of the population, this push towards expecting more, in terms of democracy, expecting more in terms of citizenship and demanding that. And then you also had this backlash from people who feel like, being American or being an American citizen is synonymous with being white and that no one else should be admitted into that. So there is definitely a power in representation. However, we can't confuse representation with systemic change, okay? We have always had, for as long as this nation has been around, we have always had Black people who were free. We've always had, in some cases, we had Black people who owned plantations and owned enslaved people, right? That does not automatically equate to systemic change. So we have to make sure that we're not simply settling for, electing someone who looks like us to office. We have to look at, like, what are the material conditions for the average person? What are the material conditions for the majority of Black people? Because that's where we really measure change. And if we look at that, the child poverty rate for Black people is the same today as it was in 1968. Okay, so just the fact that we have more access to things, or some people have more access to things, doesn't equate to automatic change.
Thank you so much. I was wondering, who are your idols and role models? How have they influenced you? And also, while we're talking about inspirations, like, are there any books or pieces of writing or parts of other movements that have inspired you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of my greatest inspirations really are people in my family, like knowing the stories of my ancestors who were enslaved, and, some of my great grandparents, they, were enslaved and founded churches like while they were still on the plantation, and just kind of like thinking of their resilience, and, just like the faith that they had to exercise in the times that they lived, that really kind of gives me a lot of inspiration for everything that I go through, because, there's some days where, it does feel really overwhelming. And I just try to keep in mind how I am only here because of the resilience, of everyone who came before me. And then, of course, all the freedom fighters of the past. I mean, very similarly, thinking about, my goodness, the conditions that they had to go through, the level of danger that they had to encounter, and the amount of courage that they had to exercise in order to do what they did. That gives me a significant amount of my inspiration, and also recognizing that silence and that doesn't really save us. There are people who become victims to the system every day for doing nothing but existing as they are, And so again, when I just kind of think about what is at stake, I feel like there's more to lose and more to risk by being silent and doing nothing, than by, trying to do something or trying to give at least as much as I can, to the cause. And then I'm just inspired by organized movements in general. I see what's happening all around the world. I mean, we, of course, are not the only country that is facing down authoritarianism right now. I mean, this is a global struggle. And I think that's important to recognize too. I think that sometimes in America, we can be a little bit in a bubble. And we really need to recognize like the international nature of this struggle, not just because it's happening everywhere, but because the United States plays a role in empire. I mean, a lot of these struggles that are going on in other nations are directly connected to policies of our government. And so that's important for us to recognize that we have a shared stake in some of these struggles that are going on around the world.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And I've gotten some questions on that. I was wondering if you could expand a little more on the global perspective in terms of the effects that we've seen throughout this movement this year.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, of course, one thing that comes to mind is like the struggle of the Palestinians. I mean, there's a lot of parallels there between the struggle of the Palestinians and the experience of, Black people and colonized people in the United States of America. One concrete way is that our police forces receive the same training. They receive, similar equipment. Many of the experiences of Palestinian people as living under, kind of like an occupied force is very similar to how Black people experience life in America. Even though we are technically, citizens, we still don't really experience full citizenship. And oftentimes we are living in communities where the police forces that oversee us are not from our communities, are not, invested in our communities. We still see fallout from US imperialism in Latin America, right? There are many cases around the world where people are struggling against authoritarian governments that were put in place by policies of the United States of America. And that is important for us to recognize when we are looking at, oftentimes when we see how it's reported on our news, it's reported as like this instability that's existing in other countries that's completely disconnected from United States policies. And it only shows up, on our shores in the form of, people seeking asylum or people trying to, mass immigrate to the United States. But a lot of this is fallout from war, from economic policy. And so we again have to recognize that when we are fighting for these things in America, such as economic justice, racial justice, religious inclusion, and democracy, our ability to achieve that here is directly connected to what's going on, internationally. And so, since my time of like really kind of becoming involved in this movement, that has been one of the major eye-opening things for me. And in terms of my awareness, was kind of becoming aware of the international nature of this struggle.
Thank you. And we're just going to pivot a little bit, but there have been a couple of long questions about this, but in brief, can you comment on the effects of inciting violence at protests?
Yes, so I'm not exactly, I feel like that can kind of go both ways. So when we're talking about inciting violence, like there's a number of things that leads to violence at protest, right? One of the major factors is the police. And I mean, I've seen this firsthand from engaging in protest in the street. That oftentimes police will engage in practices that are designed to escalate things to violence, right? So oftentimes what you'll see is that there will be quote unquote peaceful protest, right? Or kind of like protest without incident during the day. The city will set a curfew, at nighttime. In like the hour or more leading up to that curfew, the police form like a battle line. I mean, and there's, I don't know if you have never been like in the street, like at a protest, that is an extremely intimidating thing to see like a whole line of police in, gear and weaponry kind of like lined up like they are prepared to go to war with you. And then they will start to advance. They will march forward. They will start shooting tear gas. And we have to also recognize that this is coming in a context where people are denied any other avenue of justice. So we have a situation where the same police force that is forming the battle line against people just previously killed someone, or maybe even earlier that day, beat someone, or, engage in some kind of violence against people. So oftentimes it is the state that is escalating violence against people. The protesters don't fill the streets for nothing. Like, there's never a time where, everything's going along without incident. People are able to feed themselves. People have housing. People aren't experiencing harassment from the police, and they just fill the streets. It doesn't happen. These mass protests happen most often in response to state violence, okay, and incidents where police are murdering people, and we're not seeing any kind of justice or accountability, for those actions. The other thing that can frequently happen at protests is that, people who are either agents of the state or who are not agents of the state will escalate violence, right? But again, what I have seen time and time again is that people will use any kind of excuse, whether it's like, a water bottle is thrown, right? Or something set on fire, or people smash a window, as an excuse to just respond with this enormous escalation in violence from the state. The real way to de-escalate all of the violence, for everyone who wants to see peace and stability, the best way to de-escalate violence is to stop killing people, is for the police to stop harassing people, to stop killing people. For cases where the police do harass and kill people, for those police to be immediately fired, right? For us to stop putting all of the money into police and prisons at the expense of our schools and our housing and our healthcare. That's the best way for us to de-escalate violence. By the time we get to the point where, stores are being broken into and things are being set on fire, we're already past that point, and I think a lot of times the mistake that people make is thinking that we mark the beginning of violence as that point. The violence began long before that, right? Poverty is violence, okay? Constantly draining communities of resources because you're putting all of those resources into the police and prisons is violence. Racism is violence. There's a daily violence that people are living with that is normalized and doesn't draw the attention of the cameras, right? Until property gets damaged. And then we refer to it as violence. And again, when we talk about nonviolent philosophy, like for people who truly believe in, like if you really believe in having a nonviolent, beloved community type society, we have to recognize that. Like the fact that if we live in a society where we consider it violence when a window is smashed, but it's not violence that, children are dying because they don't have adequate nutrition or access to clean air and water, then we're not really understanding what violence is.
And this is our last question. I wish I could ask all of these questions, but can you touch on rural organizing and activism? How can those rural areas mobilize people and affect change where funding and representation may be limited?
Yes, that is such a great question. I honestly wish I could pull my husband onto the call because he does a lot. He's from rural North Carolina, and he does a lot of organizing out in the East, because that is so important. So often, the rural communities do get ignored and do kind of get left in the shadows. But those are some of the most important places that do need to be addressed and do need to be organized. Especially like when we look at situations like we have here in North Carolina, if we're talking about like voter disenfranchisement. I'm sure you all saw recently, like Bladenboro was in the news in 2018 because of this enormous scandal around, ballot theft, right? When people are talking about, voter disenfranchisement or lack of access to resources. Even the way that this pandemic is hitting, rural communities, or is likely to hit rural communities where you don't have as much access to, hospitals and resources. It is really important that we make sure that the resources and the energy and the people power is not just going to the urban centers. but that we really are investing in rural areas. When we're talking about climate change, I mean, again, just looking at the situation in North Carolina, it has been the eastern part of our state, the more rural part of our state, that has felt the brunt of the climate change and hurricanes and, hog farms, being overrun, right, and damaged. And so we have to recognize the importance of investing and organizing out there. And it does take some work because it's spread out, and because there's not, as much oftentimes of resources being directed that way. So I just, a lot of my organizing has been in Charlotte, obviously, but I just have so much respect for the organizers that are working out in the East. With the work that I'm doing around housing right now, even though much of my work recently has focused on like the city of Charlotte and the county of Mecklenburg County, I'm really trying to build statewide with grassroots organizers. And so that, includes working with organizers out East. And they are dealing with the same exact issues that we are dealing with here, but just often with fewer resources. So we've got to make sure that we are investing time and resources and energy in our rural communities as well.
Well, Bree, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you so much for all of your insights and your really thoughtful responses and thoughts on leadership and change. We have been so honored to have you with us this evening. We also would like to thank our audience for joining us tonight and for engaging in this important conversation and taking the time to submit questions both before and during this event. And this concludes our program. We really appreciate everybody's time and attention. Have a great night, everybody, and go Pack.